Resource Access, Part 2. In Resource Access Part 2, we're going to be discussing print sharing. This is something that you can do to, of course, allow a printer to be shared, but there's various levels of control over what happens with the printer and the print queue. So we'll take a look at some of the permissions there. We'll also take a look at the encrypting file system, which is an excellent way to protect data from prying eyes, and it's really pretty secure as well. We'll take a look here also at something called the branch cache. This is a great way to make files available to smaller branch offices over slower WAN links and to minimize the amount of latency that they have to endure. Let's start off here talking about printer sharing as we continue our discussion of accessing resources. One of the first things you want to understand is the three basic levels of permissions on a shared printer. One of the first levels of permission is just the print permission. This means that you can print, obviously. This means that you can also reorder any of the print jobs that you own, although unfortunately you can't reorder your print jobs ahead of somebody else's print jobs in the queue. Now, if you want to get permission to manage documents, then you have the ability to do things with other users' print jobs. For example, you could cancel some other user's print job. And I promise I may never have done that ever. But what you can do is cancel it, especially useful if someone's got a 200-page print job ahead of yours in the queue. You could cancel that. Of course, hopefully you have more, or rather less selfish motives than that. You can also restart a document. That might be useful if it's somehow gotten hung up and needs to be restarted. You can pause a print job if you need to perhaps maybe maintain the printer. For example, you need to change the toner or something like this. You can also reorder the print jobs, and that would include yours as well as anybody else's. You can resume any print job as well. And then for managing the printer, which is the third main level of permissions, you can pause the printer on the whole, including anything that's in the queue. You can restart the printer. This may depend upon software. Some printers have remote software that allows you to restart them remotely. Otherwise, you may just have to go back up to the printer and hit the toggle switch to restart it. And anybody can do that with physical access to the printer. You can change permissions, giving other users varying levels of permission on the printer. You can adjust the spooler permissions for that printer as well. You can also adjust the properties of the printer. Maybe you want to set its default to print double-sided, for example. And you can also then, of course, share that printer. Now, in order to configure the printer, you can go into Control Panel, where we have devices and printers here. You can right-click on the printer and then choose Printer Properties. And then once we get into this, you can go to the Sharing tab, and this is where we will then decide to share the printer and give it a specific name. You may also want to add additional drivers, especially if you're in that transitional phase where perhaps you're going from 32-bit Windows to 64-bit Windows, and you can add additional drivers here, as you can see that I have already done. If they are available for that printer, then it will show up right here, and then this was cleared, in fact, originally when I first installed this. So then I clicked it to fill in the checkbox there, and then you have to supply the drivers on like a CD or something like this to go ahead and add those drivers. And then what would happen here is when a 32-bit client connects to my computer here, or rather to my printer, then it will automatically download the drivers which I have selected there from this computer to their destination computer. And so that's how that works. And then when you want to go to security here, what happens with this is where we can manage the permissions of the printer. For example, everyone here, by default, will have the ability to print. Once they start a print job that goes into the queue, they become the creator owner, and that's what gives them the ability to manage their own documents. You can see here also that various administrative levels of people can print or manage the printer or manage the documents and so forth. And of course, administrators will also always have that ability. Next, let's move on to the encrypting file system. This is a very powerful utility that's included with Windows, and it has been ever since Windows 2000. This is a certificate-based encryption method which prevents other prying eyes from being able to see your documents. This is pretty secure. I'd say it's very secure, in fact. So far, in fact, I haven't really found any other way to be able to get around EFS except for I have found a third-party product, and it's this one right here. I have never used this or done anything with this, but according to these folks anyway, they are able to recover EFS encrypted files under a number of different scenarios. For example, the certificates that are used to encrypt a file are actually stored in the user profile. And if the profile is deleted, then the certificate may also be deleted, and so there would be no way to recover the encrypted files. Well, apparently they're able to work around that. So I don't know. This company may work, it may not, but it might be worth giving it a go if you have troubles with encrypted files that you cannot recover. Otherwise, however, it's going to be better if you just implement a proper data recovery agent, or DRA. This is going to be critical, especially in an enterprise environment. Now, this particular exam, the 70-680, focuses mostly on just the workstation. So it's not really a big emphasis on domains and Active Directory and things of this nature. But in most enterprise environments, if they're going to allow encryption at all, then they're going to already have a centrally configured DRA, and no one encrypts any files without the DRA already being included in it. The user does not have to configure that. It's all configured from a group policy object, and you can set it all up centrally and in advance to any encryption. But otherwise, you'll have to configure the DRA yourself locally, and I'll show you how to do that here in just a little while. Also, with multiple users, when EFS first came out, you were not able to encrypt a file and then share that same file with another user that can access it on the same local computer. Well, now we do have that ability, and what we'll need, though, is that the other users will also need their own certificate. So when you right-click on a file and you choose to encrypt it, if you don't already have a certificate, it will create a self-signed certificate for you. And then you will have the access to that encrypted document. Anybody else that wants access to that same encrypted document, you as the owner of the document have to grant them permission and using their own certificate. But there won't be a certificate available unless they have already created their own certificate. I'll show you about that too. This is going to be best controlled by a domain environment and group policy objects and the like. Also, the certificates that create the encryption for you, well, they can be centrally stored in Active Directory, which again makes it very easy, because if the user's profile ever gets deleted, or if the laptop or whatever the files that were encrypted on ever gets stolen or lost, well, you still have the original certificates that were used to perform the encryption in Active Directory, and you can still recover using that method. And then there's a utility called Cipher. This is actually a very powerful utility, and it's especially useful for things such as batch encryption for a number of different files, or maybe a user's certificate has changed. Well, you can use Cipher to reapply a new certificate to all of their previously encrypted files, or to add a data recovery agent to all of those files as well. Alright, let's see how this might actually play out here. What I've done is I've logged on as a user named Francine, who apparently has some affinity for the color pink. And I'm going to go ahead and go to the computer and the local disk. You can see here that she has created a folder called Francine Secret Files. Now, for other shared users of this computer that also log on to here, they're going to obviously have some curiosity as soon as they see that. So they're going to double click on this. And maybe it's her boss who's going to be able to see this resume file in here. So he or she double clicks on it, and they see this document. Interesting. So apparently she's trying to get a job somewhere else. Maybe her therapist is giving her advice to leave this job or something like that. Well, Francine might not want people to be able to see that, even though they will still be able to see the name of the file, but they might not be able to open it up, or they won't be able to open it up if we use EFS. So we'll go to the properties of the file to encrypt it. And hopefully she's technically savvy enough to even know that this is there. And then she would click Encrypt the Contents to secure data. And then click OK. And then let's just click Apply. I'm going to apply it to the file only, but you can also do it to the parent folder, which we'll very often do. And one of the reasons for that is because with documents like Word documents, they create temporary files. And if you encrypt the folder, the temporary files and the main files are both encrypted. And if you don't encrypt the temporary files, then that leaves a potential security vulnerability. But anyway, we're just going to be kind of casual about this and encrypt the file only because we just want to see how this works. Notice that she does get a prompt to back up the file encryption key, which starts this little wizard back here. And then you can just next, finish your way through it. It's real simple. You do have to password protect it. But that's available to her anyway. Now, if I go back to the details, look at this. There's Francine. she's a local user, and she's got a certificate here that is encrypting this file. Now there's a problem. We don't have a recovery policy. We don't have a recovery agent here. So I'm going to cancel all of this for the time being. But this document is now encrypted, and you can tell by looking at the green color on the label. If we double click on it, she can open it just fine. But will other people be able to? No, they won't be able to. And let's take a look at what we can do to set up the data recovery agent. So now here I've logged on as the trainer account, which is the local administrator of this computer, and I need to set things up so that I have a legit data recovery agent. So first thing I'll do is I need to generate some certificates. So I'm just going to go to a command prompt, and I'm going to do a cipher /R for recovery certificates, and this is going to be just arbitrarily named trainer recovery. How about that? Okay, and then I have to enter in a password for the PFX file because that's going to contain my private key, so this is security sensitive. And I'll confirm that password. And then if I do a dir, I should see both of those certificate files right there. Now the next thing I want to do is to open up a MMC console, and then I'm going to go to File and Add Remove Snap-in for certificates here, and then it's going to be for my own user account. Okay, so there it is. Then we'll click OK. Next thing I'll do here is to import that private certificate, the PFX certificate. Okay, so I'll have to put that into my certificate store, and I'm going to right-click here to choose Import, then I'll click on Next and Browse for that certificate. There's the trainer recovery, but the thing is, look what it's looking for, CER. The file I need is the PFX certificate. So I'm going to click this down list here, choose PFX instead. Since both of them are named the same name in the front part of this, they look identical, but this one is going to have the personal information exchange along with the personal or the private certificate, private key. So I'm going to enter in my password and put it in the personal store, and there it is. Let's double click on this, and you can see that if you go to the details here, that we can see a number of different things. For example, what is used for? It's used for file recovery, okay, which is part of encryption. If we look at the thumbprint, let's just look at the last few characters, DA3B here, so we can uniquely identify it. Notice that it is a self-signed certificate because we don't have a CA in this environment. Now the next thing I need to do is to run gpedit.msc. Now the purpose of doing this is because I need to create a policy to define my recovery agent. So I'm going to go to the Windows settings here, and then security settings, and then public key policies where we have the encrypting file system, and I need to right click here to choose add recovery agent. And then we'll click on Next and Browse. There's another item there, by the way, the Browse Directory. If you're part of an Active Directory, you can browse directory. That's not talking about directories as in folders. That's talking about directory as in Active Directory. So here's the certificate. This is just the public, the one that contains the public key. I don't need the private one for this. So I'm just going to add that one in. That'll uniquely identify this specific user. It cannot determine if it's been revoked because it's a locally generated certificate, but a certificate authority would have been able to confirm whether or not it was revoked. So that's what that message was about. And now I have a file recovery agent. Now here I've logged back on as Francine. Now I want to point out that some of the Microsoft documentation will specifically say that until this user decrypts this document and then re-encrypts it, the data recovery agent will not be included in the recovery agents. But if I go to the properties right here, right now, and I have not decrypted this document or otherwise touched it at all, except for this right click that you're looking at right now, and go to Advanced, look what happens if I go to Details now. There's the trainer account. If I expand this out, we can uniquely identify the thumbprint. Remember the last couple of characters there, DA3B. So we know that this is the right certificate, and we do have a recovery certificate associated with this particular file right now. And that, again, is in conflict with other Microsoft documentation that states that if you've encrypted a file before there was a DRA created, then the DRA will not apply to those previously encrypted files, but it will only apply to new files. Apparently, that's not true, because we have just seen that this file apparently somehow automatically picked up the new DRA. And then here I've logged back on as that trainer account just to see if I can see the file. There's the resume. You can see that it's green and it's still encrypted. If I right click on it and choose properties, I can see that it's still encrypted. And I can also see my account there as the DRA. So what I should be able to do here is to double click on it and open it up directly with all transparency here. So I double click on it, and what do you know, but there it is. So this is what the DRA is useful for, is being able to recover files that might have otherwise been unrecoverable. I mean, it could have been something more innocent. It could have just been that Francine's profile got corrupt and her certificates got corrupt as a result as well, and she never backed them up. Well, that might be another legitimate purpose for recovering her file. Now, I do want to make a recommendation here as well, and that is for EFS, that until you come up with your data recovery agent, if you right-click on this and choose Properties, you can prohibit EFS. And I would leave this setting on until you've figured out a DRA method. Because otherwise, you could wind up in a situation where you have users encrypting files that are going to be difficult to decrypt. Now then, quickly returning back here to Francine, let's also point out something else that we could do with this if we want to. And that is, if we go back into details, notice that it says users who can access this file is Francine, obviously. But I can also click on Add. Now notice that there's no one else to add. Why is that? That's because there's no other user certificates other than the DRA that have certificates on this machine. And the DRA certificate is designed for file recovery, not for file encryption. So she doesn't have anybody else she can add into this. So what I'm going to do here is go ahead and log back on as a different user and create a certificate for that person. Now then, here I've logged on as another user. This is Jesse, and Jesse is going to try to help Francine with her resume. Maybe he's really good at writing resumes. And so he sees Francine's secret files here. He double clicks on it. She's asked him for help, so he tries to double click on the, oh, access denied. I can see it, but I can't touch it. What's that saying? You can look, but you can't touch? Something I heard a lot in college, by the way. No, I'm just kidding. I didn't actually hear that. Usually it was more something like, stop staring at me, you're kind of creeping me out. Anyway, so he cannot touch this file, and it's going to be a problem. So what we need to do is to have Francine add him to the encryption of that file. Now, of course, NTFS permissions could do a similar function to this, but this would add an additional layer of security by adding encryption. Now anyway, let's go ahead and create a certificate for Jesse here. So I'm going to go to a command prompt here, and I'm going to do a cipher /K. And when we do this, it's going to generate certificates for the computer. And you can see the thumbprint there, but then doing a dir, you can also, or rather doing an MMC console, that is, if I do a MMC, then it will allow us to also add in the snap-in and just confirm that he does have a certificate here. So I'm just going to quickly go through this because we've all been here before already. And we look under Personal Certificates, and there's a certificate there for Jesse that allows encryption. Okay, and then Jesse's thumbprint once again here is going to end in 42E3. Just kind of make a mental note of that. So now we're going to just go ahead and log Jesse out here, and when we log back in, I'm going to log back in as Francine and be able to add him into this. Now here I'm logged on as Francine, and I do want to point something else out as well before I add Jesse into this through the properties, and that is that we used the cipher /K item to create Jesse's certificate. But we could have also had Jesse just encrypt his own file. Doesn't matter which file, any file. And he could have even encrypted it and then decrypted it. That also would have generated a self-signed certificate that would still be on the computer that we could then now use here to click on Add, and then there's Jesse right there. And again, once, of course, we have this certificate available, so then we can click OK, 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 and everything else. And then now what we'll see happen here is when you see the screen again, Jesse will have logged on, and you'll see that he'll be able to access this document. So then here I've logged back in as Jesse. This is the Francine Secret Files folder. Now Jesse should be able to double click and open this file, and indeed he can. So now he should be able to, edit it and modify it according to any other permissions he might have, such as NTFS permissions. All right, now let's take a look next at an additional topic. This is something called branch cache, and we'll conclude with this one. With branch cache, what goes on is it's very useful if you have a slow WAN link to a branch, or there's a lot of latency in that link to the branch. It could be because it's just slow. It might be a 128K WAN link. Or it could be that it's a faster WAN link. It's just oversaturated. There's a whole bunch of traffic that keeps going back and forth across it. Well, this is something that's a frustration for a lot of branch offices because the performance is so bad, and sometimes the files are so slow they get interrupted, and then the file transfer is never complete, and they're never able to open their files. So what we can do with branch cache is open the file at least once, and that will at least help. And this is useful especially for users that might frequently open the same exact files. So for example, maybe users open up some kind of a template file every day, all throughout the day to fill out certain kinds of reports from a file server back on in a headquarters central office. Back at the hub. But where they are, down this tiny little branch office, they have a really slow WAN link. And so every time they have to open up that file, they have to bring it across the WAN link. Well, branch cache, what it does is it will retrieve the file the first time. And then it can host it either in hosted cache mode on a Windows Server 2008 R2 server. That's important. Only works with R2. Or you could use something called distributed cache mode, which will store assorted files throughout that local area network in the branch. And it could be on any one of the client Windows 7 computers. Okay, that's important too. It only works on Windows 7 and Windows Server 2008 R2. These are the only ones that will handle it. You have to decide which one of these two methods you want to use, though, in advance. And then when you configure this, you can do this with a group policy object if you're in a domain environment. In this kind of situation, you're more than likely going to be. If you do a GPO setting, you'll also need to configure the firewall settings as well. Or if you use NetShell, which is another method for configuring this, just a matter of preference, then this will automatically open up the appropriate firewall ports for you also. So let's go ahead and take a look at how this might work. Here in my rudimentary drawing here, you can see that we've got a hub office. This is the mothership right here. And we have a file server here called FS1. Unfortunately, we've got to live with this 56K WAN link down to this little tiny office over here. And we always have to open up, or several times a day, the same files back across this WAN link. Well, the first user might be successful in opening up that file, but the second user may not be because of this low WAN link, and plus, even if they can open it, they have to look at an hourglass for a long time and just wait unnecessarily. Well, now what happens here is with branch cache, it'll take that file that it downloads, this document of some kind, from the mothership down to this computer that accessed it first. And now it's going to be cached on this computer. That way, when this computer or this computer needs that same file, it's aware of branch cache. And it'll first, if this is a 80 millisecond or less latency on this WAN link, and you can configure that in policy if you want. But if it's 80 millisecond or less or more by default, then it will say, oops, that's a slow WAN link. I'm going to see if anyone else has this. Oh, you've got it. Well, I'll just borrow that same file from you then. And don't worry about if someone's changed something or anything like that. It does a comparison to see if the one on the file server is newer or modified compared to the one that we have in our local cache. It does still have to transmit some data because it has to make that comparison, but at least it doesn't have to download the entire file over again. Now, another way that this could work, if I clean up a little bit here, is that instead of putting it on any one of these other Windows 7 computers, you could have a dedicated Windows Server 2008 R2 computer that will always store any of the cached documents from this server over here using branch cache, and then all the clients would always go to this particular hosted Windows Server 2008 R2 server to get these cached documents. Now, I don't have an actual WAN link to demonstrate this for you, but I do want to show you how I would configure this if I were to use hosted cache mode on a Windows Server 2008 R2 server. Again, this is actually my own server, but this again would be what I would do if I wanted to cache everything on a specific server as opposed to distributing it across Windows 7 clients. Here I would go into Server Manager, right-click on Features, and choose Add Features. Once I'd gone into this, I would simply look for the branch cache item, select it, and then next finish my way through the wizard. So this comes up here, and then we go to our little branch cache, click on the little checkbox, next, and then install it, and that's pretty much all there is for the initial part of this. The other thing we would have to do is we would need to add the branch cache for network file role service as well. Now then what I would do here is go to File Services and choose add role services. I've already installed file services. If you haven't, then you'd go to roles, right click there, and choose file services. Once you've gone into that, the next thing you need to add is the branch cache for network file role service. And then here's where we would go. We would go to branch cache for network files. Then you would click next, next, and finish. I'm going to cancel that for the time being because I'm not going to actually use it, but that's what you would do in terms of configuring the server initially. And then the next thing you would have to do is to go to this group policy setting under computer configuration policies, administrative templates, network, and LAN man server. Notice that there's a single policy here that says hash publication for branch cache. This is what's used to make sure that the file that the client is trying to open up is the most current version, and that they're not opening up a cached version that is stale compared to an updated version that's on the original file server back in the hub office. Because what happens here is it runs a simple mathematical hash against the file on the file server. It doesn't require a lot of WAN bandwidth to do this, and then it takes that mathematical result and compares it against a version that's in the cache locally in their own network. And if they match, it'll just use the one that's in the local cache. And if they're different, then it'll just retrieve that file from across the WAN link and get that updated version. And then what you would do is you just double click the policy and you would enable this, and then you would choose one of these options. You could allow hash publication for the shared folder or only for shared folders on which the branch cache is enabled. And that's how that would be configured for you there. And then what we would also see is you would go to the properties of a shared folder, and on the sharing tab, you'd go to advanced sharing, and then you'd go to this caching item. Now I have not actually fully enabled branch cache, so you can see here that it's grayed out. But if I wanted to enable branch cache here as a resource from the hub office, for example, I would click enable branch cache, and then we would be able to work with this as a cached resource. Now, an important part of this is to make sure that we have the proper authentication take place, because when your clients contact the hosted cache server, we want to make sure that it really is that server, not some impersonator, and we can take advantage of certificates to do that. Here I've got a clustering server that maybe this one is supposed to be my hosted cache server. I've got a certificate here that was installed, and it should be issued by a trusted certification authority, once again, so that the clients will also trust it. And here, if we go to the properties and the thumbprint, we need to know that thumbprint before we can proceed. So you can press Control-C to copy that into your clipboard. And then I also used just Notepad here to copy out the rest of the command. And here it is. You'll use netshell and then HTTP add SSL cert IP port, and that's 0.0.0.0. That's all zeros. :443, which is the SSL port, and then the certificate hash. Notice that this is without spaces in it, and when you see it in the actual certificate, it has spaces, so you got to remove all those. And then the application ID. The hosted cache mode application is actually this unique identifier, and that's how it's identified by Windows instead of by plain English words, so to speak. So what we're going to do is we're going to register this certificate with this application that we see down here. And we're going to do that from an administrative command prompt, or an elevated command prompt. And you can see I've already pasted that in there. Then once you've got that in, you just press enter, and it will associate the certificate with the proper application. Now, if we switch gears here, and we're going to use branch cache, but we're going to use the distributed cache mode, where we're not going to set everything up on a Windows Server 2008 R2 server, but use our Windows 7 clients to host the cache. Then what we'll do is a few other items. Number one, you can configure the whole thing using group policy object, but if you do, then you also have to manually go in here and enable the appropriate firewall rules, and you can see there's several branch cache items here. And then if you used netshell from a command line instead, then that will automatically configure the appropriate firewall rule settings. So just two different ways of going about the same thing. It's a matter of preference almost. One of the things you'd have to do if you did the GPO method is you'd have to open up the branch cache content retrieval item, which you would enable this. And then you would also have to enable the second item here, which would be the peer discovery item, which we can see here, and that just opens up another port to allow it. And that's how these peers will be able to find each other and to find out whether or not they have the cache necessary. There's also this hosted cache client, hosted cache client server right here. But even though that appears in the inbound rules, you don't actually configure that one here. What you're going to do is go to the outbound rules and configure this one as an outbound rule here. on the client side. So you'd have to enable that rule as well. Okay? And then what you would do is you'd go ahead and configure it using the appropriate group policies, and I'll show you those. Now, the group policy settings that we would use, and I'm just using the local policy because I just want to show you the interface and where it would appear, but I would probably actually configure this in a group policy object in Active Directory that would be linked to an organizational unit that contained all the computers that were in the branch. But anyway, we would go to the administrative templates, control panel, and then we would go down, actually, excuse me, that's not right, we'd go to network, network, and then we'd go to branch cache here, and then you can see several settings that are enabled here. First of all, we would have to turn on branch cache, we'd enable that, okay. The next setting we would go to is we would set the branch cache distributed mode, and we would enable this. Okay, this allows us to access resources in a distributed method. We would choose. You can also choose hosted cache mode. We're not using that in this case, but if we were using the hosted cache, then we would have to enter in the name of the server. You know, cache 1. That would be the name of the server .nuggetlab.com or whatever it is that we were using. We're not actually using that method though, so I'm going to skip past that one for the time being. Then we would also, oops, I lost my desktop connection. Let me try to reconnect that one here, and I'll come back into it. For some reason, the network connection just dropped. Must have a slow WAN link or something. So anyway, the next one would be branch cache for network files. And with this one, we would enable that, and we would specify by default how many milliseconds we would tolerate for network latency and round trip. Like I said, 80 milliseconds is the default, but if we're more patient than that, we could say 100, or if we're less patient, we might say 50, or 500, 50. Okay, so this gives you an idea for some of the things that we could configure there. And then for the my goodness, I just lost my connection again, but there we're back again. Okay, so I don't know what's going on with that. And so then you can also set here the percentage of disk space that you want to use for the client computer cache. And when you set this up, I wish they would say here percentage or megabytes or gigabytes or whatever. This is a percentage of the total disk space that can be dedicated to the client computer cache, and that's all that really is. And then if you want to use NetShell, I'm going to quickly just show you here the commands that you would type in from an administrative command prompt. You would do a NetShell, and then we would do a branch cache. It's not case sensitive, and then you would do a show status. Just want to see whether or not it's enabled or not. We can see here that it's disabled. All right. So we'll go ahead and get some things going here. We want to go ahead and NetShell branch cache set service mode equals distributed. Okay, we'll go ahead and set all that up, and you can see here that it does do the firewall rules for you automatically, so that's kind of handy. And then if you wanted to set up the size of the cache that we want to configure, I just say here, arbitrarily 10%, and we'll let that go ahead and go. And then what we would do is just go ahead and allow branch cache to do its thing. The firewall ports are already open. Another thing that would happen here as well is that it would then enable the service. Let me go ahead and show you that. That would be a NetShell branch cache, and then show local cache. If we wanted to see if there was anything in the cache right now, if we wanted to look at the contents of it. And then I'm just going to go ahead and run the show status item again here. The service may not be started again until I restart the computer, but we'll see here or that it actually is running. Okay, so there we go. See, the service is properly going. Now, if you really don't want that, or if you want to just reset this, you can do a NetShell branch cache and then reset. And that sets everything back to the way it was before. And then quickly jumping over here, I wanted to go to the services node as well to point out that there is a branch cache service. This is set to manual, and that is the proper configuration of this service, even if branch cache has been properly configured, either for hosted cache or distributed cache mode, either one. But this will not start up until the client actually needs to retrieve something from a branch cache, hosted cache mode server, or a distributed cache elsewhere on the network. Okay, once it needs to retrieve something, then you should see this service start. And if it doesn't, then you might, and you need it to because it's just not operating properly somehow, you might need to go in here and manually start it. But most of the time, it should work out pretty well on its own. In this nugget, we took a look at resource access. This was part 2, where we looked at printer sharing first of all. Remember, there's varying levels of permission that you can apply to this, so that users can either manage the printer, manage the documents, manage the cube, or manage only their own documents with the print permission. We also took a look at the encrypting file system, or EFS. This is a pretty secure way of being able to protect the data. And we also showed you how to configure a data recovery agent, which is a critical part of all this. We looked at the branch cache, which is a great way to improve performance for branch offices connected over a slow WAN link, so that they don't have to unnecessarily retrieve the same data over the WAN link many times throughout the day. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.